Here we see God providing good gifts for life. And we're going to see that these gifts for life point us to His Son, in whom we have capital L, life. So we're going to look at food for life, a place for life, and then the Son for life, to whom these things point. Okay? So we're going. So first, God, not in chronological order here, it's on the same day, but let's start with food because that's more essential, right? So when He made the earth, when he made the dry land appear, so I believe that He'd already created the physical substance of the solid earth, but it was all covered in water. So he on the third day, He divided the water, He separated the water supernaturally from the land and made the dry land appear. That dry land was already underneath the waters. He made it appear. And that was, as we're going to see, to provide a place from which our food could spring. And so let's look at the food for life that He's given us. Here, it's all plant life. Grasses, look at verse 11. Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind. Whose seed is in itself on the earth and itself. So every category of plants, basically. The stuff that grows in the fields, including the low-lying things, and then shrubs and plants with vegetables and all of that, and herbs, and then the trees. And God did this first and foremost to provide food for His creatures. In one sense, plants are alive, but in another sense, biblically, they're not. The Bible distinguishes between animal and human life and plant life. That's why Paul can say that through one man, sin and death entered the world. That before the fall, they didn't eat animals. They didn't kill animals. And it's not to say that everyone should be a vegetarian, because God clearly is okay with us doing that now. But the point is that even though in one sense plants that have these cells that are amazing and there's stuff moving and going on, they don't have life in the sense of having any kind of spirit and life where they're doing things like animals and even more so like we do. So that's why it's not arbitrary, because the word for nephesh, soul, is used about the animals and about humans. Now, we're different from them, but the point is that nephesh, that life, that living life, those living beings are ascribed to animals and people only. So that's why it's not arbitrary to say, the reason evolution is not true is because death would have had to occur before sin. And the Bible says that death of real life didn't happen until this first man sinned. So if you're like, what in the world are you talking about? We can talk about it later. So food. All that we need. Isn't it amazing that God made, we'll see this in the Garden of Eden later, but all these different kinds of fruits and foods. I joke with people that God could have created us to live on cold oatmeal. He could if He had chosen to, right? If He was boring. But He's not boring. There's a rich diversity. There's every kind of grass. When you're driving on the highway and they've mowed that sweet grass, you know what I'm talking about? And it wafts into the car and you're like, oh, spring break, hallelujah. I could go on and on. The whole culinary craft and art and gift is dependent upon diversity. The diversity of herbs and spices and the combinations thereof. So the food that He gave us was not mercenary, it was not utilitarian. It was for pleasure and for life. It's awesome. Now some of you kids are like, veggies, not so much. Yeah, I like strawberries sometimes, fruits are alright. Give me chicken nuggets. But as you get older, your taste buds will change and you will grow to appreciate how good roasted, what are the ones that people hate that look like little cabbages? Thank you. Roasted Brussels sprouts. How good those can taste. when you boil them, they stink. Parents, please don't boil them. Right? When you roast them, there's this rich, burny, almost sweet flavor to them, right? So what the things that God made on this day were for us. Food. You can live without a home for a while, but you can't live without food for that one, right? So, but you can't get food if there's no dry land. And there weren't yet sea creatures and all that. So God made food for life. Notice how he made them each according to their kind. These plants were created by God directly. The ground did not have any intrinsic power to create this kind of life, lowercase L life, whatever you want to put it. But God created them directly. He made full, mature trees in one day, right? But those trees had the promise of perpetual procreation. You like that? They had the seed in them themselves, so God made these, but they were meant to continue. And through the easy cultivation of the earth before the fall, then it gets harder. Farming ain't no fun after the fall, right? But there was this diversity, but God promised to maintain this distinction so that you can have different vegetables, you know? They don't all become just one thing. And so it's beautiful. And we see here that, again, the diversity did not come from an evolution from one single thing to other things. There were different kinds created on the same day, and those kinds would perpetuate, but there's the genetic potential for greater diversity within those kinds. So, for example, God created certain plants, but there is an adaptation thing. There's potential in there. You know, you think about Adam, you know, and then you think about the diversity of people after Adam. Adam and Eve were two people. Every other person on the face of the earth came from those two people. There is genetic potential for diversity of appearance, and that's to be celebrated. Same thing with this. But so the people are one kind in one sense. You know, the scientific language of species and stuff doesn't always match the categories that the Bible uses. So kind is a bigger category than species, and yet there's diversity there. So God gave us food for life. The second thing he gave us is a place for life. Again, how well would you do if God never made a division between the waters and the dry land and never made dry land appear? How long would we live? Well, we wouldn't have any food, so we'd die pretty quickly. We also wouldn't have any place to stand. And I'm not going to do look through the whole Bible all down the line thing this morning, but there's lots of imagery about, you know, he drew me out of many waters. Like we talked about before, the space between the waters is a space of salvation and protection from judgment, because the waters were judgment. But you also had to have dry land to have that space. I know this sounds passionate, but you need ground to walk on. And you know, if you're on a ship for a long time, and you think about in the book of Acts that journey to Rome that Paul was on, or think about the story of the Odyssey, you know, you begin to appreciate dry lands the more you go, the longer you go without seeing any dry land, right? And our technology makes travel a lot faster now, but throughout most of world history, if you were going to go anywhere across the waters, you went a long time without seeing any dry land. And so you were so thankful. Now, well, how did they have a place to live? The place to live doesn't just mean safe ground for you to walk on so you don't drown. And we're like, he brought me out of the miry clay and set me upon a rock. That's one aspect. Just to have a place to live. But where do we get our dwellings? The earth, the rocks, stones. People would live in caves sometimes and stuff. But how else do we have homes? Some of us have metal, you know, in the home, structural beams and stuff that comes from the earth, the dry land that we wouldn't be able to access if it weren't there for us. Think about the gift of trees giving us wood. What was the ark built out of when there was no dry land to rest upon? Trees, right? Wood. Think about clay and then straw. Just everything. Carl was going to study architecture, he told me. Architecture. How does architecture happen? Because of the third day of creation. That's how architecture happens. You have to have a place to put the building on, and then you have to have materials from which to build that building. And everything necessary for us to have a place to live, a safe shelter. I don't know if any of you have been homeless. I'm fortunate to not have been homeless. Jesus was not that fortunate. It says, foxes have holes and birds in the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. He was couch surfing in Capernaum at Peter's mother-in-law's house or something. He was staying with people. He was never a homeowner. Right? Jesus was homeless. He was staying with friends. How you doing, man? Well, it's all right. I'm staying with friends right now. Jesus can relate. But he had a place to dwell in through other people's hospitality. And God, on the third day, provided not only food for life, but a place for life and the materials to build structures of protection. Think of fortresses built of bricks or stones, right? Shelter. God provided the foundation for shelter and the means to build shelter for us. And the last thing that God did through this day is legitimately point us ahead to the Son who had not only created all of these things for life, but who had become flesh to be the one in whom we have life. And I want to show you that. Remember that God is eternal, and that one day with the Lord is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And the reason I say that is because when you think about the Gospels and what happens in the Gospels and the language that's used in the Gospel, the vocabulary used in the different Gospels, what you have to remember is that God had planned all of this. He had written the story. Psalm 139, behold, all the days that you have ordained for me are already written in your book, O God. God is the author who wrote the story even before he created the stage and lit the stage and brought the players, right? This story was the story of the Son. And so if you want to think about it in terms of time and eternity and everything, Genesis is right next door to the Gospel of John. Does that make sense? That in God's plan, it's all there, and God has all of that other stuff in his heart and mind when he's doing this stuff. So it is legitimate. I don't want to read Jesus into places where he isn't, but the fact that he made this and he knew that he was going to come and be the seed and be the bread of life and die on a tree kind of makes this stuff preach the gospel. Does that make sense? Yes. So look. The seed. That's really important. See, God's special revelation, his word, the law of the Lord, as it were, depends upon our knowledge and experience of his general revelation of creation, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows forth his handiwork, and yet the law of the Lord is perfect in burning the soul, right? But the law of the Lord is dependent upon God's creation for you to understand it, as well as the very pictures that Jesus gives that show us the kingdom of God. All of his parables depended on the physical creation to make sense of his spiritual kingdom, right? So think about this. How important is the Hebrew word zerah, seed? How important is that? It's one of the most fundamental, repeated, covenantal history marker words throughout the whole of Scripture. What's the first title for Jesus? Seed. I'll put enmity, the Lord, right? Because he's the Lord, right? But in terms of the prophecy of his incarnation, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between her seed and your seed. He, singular, shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. God created seeds, yes, to give us food, but just like marriage, Marriage doesn't happen to work out as a nice illustration for the relationship between Christ and his church. God designed marriage to preach the gospel. Right? Does that make sense? It's not an afterthought. So the way that God designed food to be given through, again, life is different between plants and animals and humans, but life through death. What does Jesus say? Think about that. You have to kill the plant in order to draw nourishment from it and to live, but how does the plant even get there? It's through death and resurrection, right? Jesus in the Gospel of John said, unless a grain or kernel of wheat or a grain or a seed dies and goes into the ground and is buried, it will bear no fruit. But if it dies, then it springs forth much fruit. We see that here, even on day 3. With the plants being created, with the seeds in their place, with the prophecy of the coming death of those seeds by which life would be given to us. The second thing is the fact that God made trees. You know, what's the importance of a tree? Why is it a big deal that God made trees on the 3rd day? Because cursed is the one who is hanged upon a tree. And it was prophesied, because Jesus was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, that in order to truly give us eternal life after the fall, the Son would have to hang upon a tree. That's the significance of the bird coming back with the leaf in its mouth after the flood. It's that God has promised to preserve the theater of redemption. Isn't that amazing? The props of the play, if you will. The props of the movie. We go to this sort of hippie pool and smoke rides. It's more laid back, and the lifeguards don't chew you out all the time. And we met this guy who's a prop maker for the film, TV and film industry. I mean, it sounds like a really interesting job. Well, things have meaning of themselves, and trees are wonderful for all kinds of reasons to give us food. But the fact is that the Son would come to die and suffer and be cursed in our place for our sins on a tree, die and rise again on the 3rd day. And last, the food. Jesus said, I'm the bread of life. I'm the bread which came down from heaven, that those who eat of it may live and never die, have eternal life. These grasses, these grains, this wheat, this barley and spelt and Ezekiel bread recipe stuff in the whatever, organic section, whatever, all that, this all came on the 3rd day, right? Bread that in order to give life has to be crushed and consumed. Jesus said, he who eats this bread, right, will never hunger or thirst. So he says, I'm the bread which came down from heaven. I'm the bread of the world. I'm the bread from God. He says, he who believes in me has everlasting life. Do you know what picture he gave of believing in him? It's a gross vampire horror movie picture. He says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of God and drink his blood, you have no life in you. He's not talking about cannibalism, but he's talking about the Christian faith that says, I live by his death. That the one who came as a seed to die, to make us the fruit in his resurrection, the one who came to be hanged on a tree, became the very fruit of life for us from that tree, the very bread of life from the grasses and the shrubs, by being consumed in our place and by being fed upon through faith. This day 3 was for life, not just immediate food and shelter, but to set the stage and to bear in seed form, pun intended, the promise of the Son of God himself, who would be our shelter, our refuge, our righteousness, in whom we are hidden. It would be our food, in whom we have life, through his living a good life in our place. having our crimes imputed or credited to him, that he might bear the curse that we alone deserve. He stretched out upon that fateful tree, that promised tree, to become for us the bread of life. Amen. Please pray with me. Father, we love you. We thank you how you love